Welcome back, Rhetoric Warriors podcast. Once again, descending upon the topics of the world to try to add some clarity or our own version of non-clarity, linguistic non-clarity. I am Dr. Dan French, American rhetorician, rhetoric PhD, escape professor, stand-up comedian, comedy writer, all the things. And I try to do three things on here. I grab comics. I haven't done that lately. I got to grab some comedians and see what they think about the world. There's a guy, Tom Simmons, who I did the very first episode with, and he's been doing a run of abortion jokes on Instagram, just trying to set some kind of record. And I also talked to the right, which I also haven't done for a while. I need to grab some righties, see what's going on in MAGA world. And I try to convert them. And I talk to persuasion professionals and rhetoricians, such as my friend, Dr. Dave Payne, who is back again today. It's got to be like 20, 25, I don't know, something like that.
Who's counting? Yeah.
Apparently not me. Well, the last time we got here, there's so many big things going on in the world, right? So the last time we were all up in the rhetoric of dystopia, which sort of ties into the rhetoric of war that we were doing before. Right now, with the abortion ruling coming down the pipe, they told us it's coming down the pipe. Get ready. We thought we'd turn to some more political issues with, great replacement theory. So we're going to dive in today and see what rhetoric thinks about replacing humanity with humanity.
Well, I think that's it. I think now that it's got a name, great replacement theory. I mean, it's something that's been lurking there all along as you start peeling back some of these layers of clarity. It really is pretty murky down there. And I think now that it has a name, rhetoricians can go to work on it, I think. Because there's a lot, the disclaimer here is, as I start kind of, I toyed with the idea or the easy reference that this is the tip of an iceberg, but it really isn't. It's more like one of the tentacles of a really bad cancer that's wrapped itself around the spine of the body politic, if you will indulge the metaphor, and it has many other tentacles that are clamping down here, and so it's bound up with racism, obviously, and other things that they're probably better historians and experts for many of these things than certainly I am. And but the question of what can rhetoric say about this, or why is it sort of exploded as we're now that we're aware of it and have a handle for it. And I think
I think that's kind of the thing, right? Like, yeah, there are definitely people who this is what they do. I mean, race studies and things like that are right at the center of this. But this all started with the Buffalo shooter and the manifesto, the most recent manifesto about replacement theory, and then that being linked back up to Tucker/Pucker Carlson. And the fact that the right has been intimating towards this and shading towards replacement theory, and the idea that the white population of America is being slowly eroded.
Well, there was this kind of Sasquatch sighting of it in Charlotte, right, with the chant, "They will not replace us," and people kind of go, that's hinky. But it didn't really step forward as and they didn't do the polls. I mean, right now the polling that a third of Americans believe in some version of the great replacement theory. Basically, half of people claiming to be Republicans and a fifth of people claiming to be Democrats. So it's got that kind of status now, right?
Well, and I always
think
think
a question in our poll.
I have all these little structures that I've built over the years, especially to work with businesses, because I need to simplify things where it can work at speed. And one is the sense of trinaries about over here's the most negative ways of looking at things, and here's the positive Pollyanna, and here in the middle is the mixy. And so when you see something like replacement theory, that's clearly dragging things over into the dystopian, into the negative, language of the rhetoric of negativity. Over here on the right, it's this multiculturalism is a form of replacement. It's intermixing, it's sort of evolving, it's all the good terms for changing things from just a white homogenized culture into a multiplicitous culture. Same process, really. It's just whether you're going to stick it there in the middle where people are like, yeah, I like some of it, not all of it. You're going to drag it all the way over here and just amplify the fear and hatred and ugliness, or keep it over here as a rosy path down evolution.
Right, but the basic idea and anxiety here about this has a pretty deep history that goes probably all the way back to the beginning of, I mean, you just can't really at some point separate this from slavery and the legacy of slavery.
You can't separate it from the Native Americans, for God's sake. You talk about a replacement theory.
Well, yeah, here's the deal, is that at one point replacement theory was you think about manifest destiny. We are here to replace you. Right?
Yeah,
basically.
We're the better version of humanity.
And furthermore, this was a heavenly inspired mission. God had in mind that white people replace all you other people. And blacks weren't even considered at the time. I mean, so we were replacing Indians and Mexicans, essentially.
Well, and then the Asians kind of came in on the West as workers, right? And that became, and then the low-class Irish came in as a replacement fear. Like this sort of immigration wave or conquering wave, all these types of replacements have been going on forever.
Well, yes, and the immigration issue is another sort of set of tumors in this conglomeration, right? So it certainly hasn't been backstage, but it didn't really trigger the anxiety. Oh, immigration. Well, we're going to have all these people coming into the country. All the issues that surrounded immigration. But only Tucker and Trump explicitly sort of called that out as, the base level, sort of the bottom layer of replacement theory, which is that we're bringing in immigrants to change the vote, basically as a political maneuver. And apparently that's the version that over 1/3 of the people really believe, is that is itself a political move. But I think replacement goes beyond that. I don't think we're just replacing voters. I don't think when we're chanting "Don't replace us," that's really what is being said there, right? So I think that's just one kind of surface.
Well, I think when you pull up the emotion of anxiety, that's the perfect emotion to apply here, right? It's great if you can fan anxiety over into fear, and terror, which is, sort of the left's rhetorical play. But it is this sense of there's something coming, and it's dark and foreboding, and it doesn't want us here. And that's that kind of deep-seated anxiety that they keep, going after.
Sure. I mean, well, how long have we been hearing that, projected by 2050, whites will be the minority in this country? And even as a good liberal, multiracial diversity, whatever, one has to go, well, what does that really mean for me? So what does that actually entail? And so I think anxiety that, in various degrees is yeah, you're right. It's kind of that is what it does sponsor, is uncertainty about future, because and in what ways does our sort of faith and reliance, trust in the dominant structures of society depend upon, right, this sort of ancient paradigm of white domination.
Well, it's not something,
that's the cage that's getting rattled here.
Right, and that's maybe the most interesting thing about it, is when you start bringing up into the overt, under the glare of the real lights, the idea of, okay, white country. That's the base here, right? And it's not something that we often talk about in schools or anything else, or even history. Is like, hey, you hear the words, but you don't really think about the fact, like white people in this culture have an advantage because it's been a white homogenized dominant culture. And so either you're moving to this, again, sort of semi-sense of utopian equality where everybody's got the same chance, it's a meritocracy, or you're moving into an unadvantaged or disadvantaged for the whites, which is what, again, one of the things they pull over into dystopia. It's like, oh, they're not just replacing you, they're not going to exercise a form of revenge against you that you didn't earn, but now like you are at a disadvantage by being white.
The moment of anxiety turns into fear, right? And fear is really the fuelable emotion at the base of all this, for sure.
Yeah, that's the political fuel, right? Like when you can move this over into, hey, this isn't just multiculturalism. We're not just sharing and competing together. You are now at a disadvantage and you're going to lose and it's going to be ugly.
I think that is definitely, what kind of legacy does hatred and mistrust have anyway?
So how do you balance that though? Because it's clear, like I was in this sort of juncture of white guy, sort of middling academic, coming out of, programs and not really being able to compete the way that maybe I would have been 20 years ago, with sort of the kind of not premier jobs, but secondary jobs that they're kind of handing out to people. And then I went into entertainment, and like my first job at Best Damn Sports Show, a friend of mine got me a tryout, and they literally told me, we can't hire you because we can't put another white guy onto our hired roles. And they kept me there for a year and a half without ever formally hiring me. So I've been in the royal a little bit of what it means to be a white guy coming into a system that's trying to correct itself, and that it be a programmatic, move, like, oh, we're trying to increase diversity across gender and race and all these different factors. I've never felt particularly beat up by it because I know like I've got all these other advantages coming in. I've had clean education and stability and all the things that a lot of people don't have. But it is a thing, when you start making programmatic policy changes within, a culture to try to counterbalance and right things. So there's enough of that kernel of truth in it that when they start to, fan the flames of fear, I think they've got a little bit of logos to hold on to that people have a hard time arguing against.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I hear that story and I kind of go, really? Was that really the problem? Not any personal slight to you, but when were they not able to hire whoever they wanted to? Strikes me as odd. Although I have heard other stories about that are the other side of the coin. They said they can only have one black guy doing this, right? So.
It's just an odd thing to, like I said, program, into the rules of businesses or, educational institutions anywhere. It's a hard thing to program. I grew up in Louisville when Louisville had forced busing, and I was at a private Catholic school, so it didn't affect us. But I remember watching the riots, on TV, and one of the cops that got hurt by fishing tackle, I think, which is so Kentucky, he got hit in the face with fishing tackle during one of the riots. He came and talked to our school about it. And so I've seen up close what that happens when you try to make strong, programmatic, fast changes to a culture, and how, what happens when anxiety is stoked, like how it truly does easily emerge into violence.
Sure.
As a rhetorical structure, right? Like they've got the stories, they've got the emotion, now the physicality of it isn't that hard to trigger.
Well, I mean, competition is, it has always been sort of economic competition has always been part of the fueling of racial, I mean, racist attitudes are one thing, but racial violence and, open hostility is quite another. And I think once again, if you wanted to look at the history of this thing, you have to look, back at that, and one restoring what happened after the Civil War, I think, is part of this, that basically Reconstruction was working for a while, but it was working because there were, federal troops in the South. And at least one of the things I read was basically in the election of 1876 was when Reconstruction ended, and the Republicans, who in those days were the good guys apparently, we had a challenged election with what they've been threatening lately with people states choosing their own electors and things like this, right? And basically the Republicans made a deal. Okay, give us the presidency and we will take the military out of the South. We'll take the troops that we're enforcing. But just in the last few years, although I've thought about and read about racism and for a long time, didn't quite realize how much there were things going on. Black people were voting and they were being elected to positions, and that a lot of what we count now as a lot of things we built statues to commemorating the South was really done later as part of the movement to wipe out that progress. So it was in response to that competition, in response to that sense of being replaced. And I think as the trickle up, that's happening in mayorships and state government in the South in
Sure.
the 1800s. It didn't happen nationally until Barack Obama was elected. And so if you think about replace that anxiety over replacement being kind of a gurgling cauldron underneath the surface here, right? That is sort of fueling these flashes of anxiety about race. And so I think we have entered into a new kind of Jim Crow. That is, voter suppression and that sense that, I heard some politicians in Georgia yesterday railing against, whatever else we do, we've got to unify here to make sure that Stacey Abrams is not our next governor. This is the appeal. And not the next president. They always add that quickly. So they're already thinking the way you're thinking. Right? That she will replace him.
Well, I think it's a sense of, and again, like I'm just trying to look at the rhetorical field. So sort of here in the middle is the mixy, and over here's the horrific dystopian, over here's the utopian vision of this. And like, even if you look, like you were saying at the very beginning, for definitions and words that we're using, replacement, really strong, word, versus like even like incursion or encroachment, which also apply. Like if you move this over to a different terminology and you tell people like, yeah, white culture, which has not been challenged, is now actually having real competitors come up on race, issues. So like, yeah, you're scared of it because now you actually have competition on a racial axis.
Yeah, but once I started trying to deconstruct this a bit. I thought, well, what does it mean to be replaced? That means you've appointed yourself to some position here. That's the surprise. And I thought, when I wrote about failure, I started looking at failure terms in a kind of a literal way, and disappointment struck out to me. You've appointed yourself to something, and now you're disappointed. And that struck me as this is an expression of disappointment. I've appointed myself through white privilege as some sort of legacy of power here that I get through some sort of racial identity, which is kind of new, surprise to me. I don't think I ever quite shared from that pool in that way, right?
Right.
But they have called this Trumpism, white identity politics, and in a way this is a dimension of that, right? So clearly these guys have appointed themselves to something by virtue of their white status. It doesn't seem to be anything to do with how good their job is or how important they are in society. That they will somehow be disappointed from. That to me is the first thing. And it also struck me, just to kind of get this out on the table, that this is right now sort of the shadow of critical race theory. Mm-hmm. That great replacement is kind of the dark twin, evil twin here. Of what critical race theory pisses off so much is this idea that somehow if we start unraveling back to this fundamental institutional racism as a warrant, what you're going to dislodge here, you're going to replace in a sense, or somehow do damage to this very amorphous inherited sense of entitlement and privilege. That these are more directly juxtaposed. So that's at least a very general rhetorical move I'm making on what charges this atmosphere.
Yeah, and I think when you say like privilege, the opposite or the flip side of privilege to me has always been that non-privileged or disadvantaged, like held back, like somehow the competition isn't fair because of artificial things that we've done. And right. That's what I think in some ways, when you look across, there are so many factors that you can use to do identity distinguishing, right? And so if we start with race, and you're like, okay, other races have been disadvantaged. We are now going to make them at least equal. That feels like you're taking away advantage, because you actually are taking away advantage. It's like you've only succeeded because you've had great education, stable families, money underneath you, connections, easy rise through the systems. We can't leave those alone for you. You can't just, use those surfboards when the other races don't have those, because it's not a fair system. So in some ways it is like, yeah, we are taking away these advantages that you didn't earn other than being that color, and having a stable family.
Well, and I think male privilege is a similar, trigger.
Yeah, like there's all sorts of like you can go to gender, you can go to class, like you talk about the riots across competitive, like all the Starbucks unionizing right now. And the fact that has, because it's Starbucks, which is already sort of an evil entity mothership, it seems like people are okay with it. And the Reagan union busting rhetoric hasn't come in to evilize that yet. But race is clearly one of those things that it's really easy for human beings to feel racial, to interpret things racially.
Well, historians, I guess, tell us that if you get back to, the days in which slavery, it wasn't so much about race. That race is kind of a theory that grew up in the 19th century, I guess. So I don't know that it is as a natural or as innate as we seem to.
It's hard to say at this point, right? This is with the history of America and like slavery in America and that sort of super.
I think we have used race as a placeholder for many things. But Malcolm X called it 60, 70 years ago when he said, every white blue-eyed thing has already become an American. Everything that came to our shores, so you talked about the history of immigration. Yeah, there was resistance to Irish and Italians and on and on and on. But we somehow managed to get over that. And in the 60s, he's saying, and the black man yet is not enfranchised here. There's something to use that as a kind of a categorical barrier. And once again, what fuels that kind of distinction? And I think that's when we are in the dimension of language, and that somehow that's an easily enforced ultimate categorical, and makes absolutely no sense when it comes right down to it.
Well,
but we can substitute that for all of our class struggles, class mobility, and it's a way of not ever talking about class when it comes right down to it.
When you look at the wheel of all the different differentiators, it's basically just moving around on the wheel. Race is such a clean one, it seems like, because it is visual. It's an easy thing for people at all levels of education and intellect to grab onto. So like when you look at the rhetorical construction of race, what does that actually look like in America? Like if we raised everybody right now on a very different axis from kindergarten all the way through, like out here in California, I used to do a joke about you kind of can't be a racist in Los Angeles because you would be exhausted. You don't even know what people are at this point. It's like, you're from where? I don't know if I should hate you or not.
Yeah, except we've had probably the most intense racial conflicts there of any. So I'm not sure.
It's a joke, right? It's about the, it's not the reality of. There's clear I mean, Los Angeles
Clear
has
and
a massive
extreme.
history,
Clear and
massive
extreme.
history of oppression of Latinos and Blacks and Asians in this state.
But
But
once again, if we, going historical, that's not a new thing at all. And the conversation about race is kind of one of these moments where this feeds into a much larger rhetorical mythic stream, it seems to me. And I guess one of the things I was looking at, he was quoting the opening lines of The Great Gatsby, where he's really talking about being replaced, right? That we have to maintain. If you think about that age, the eugenics movement in the United States was also very strong, right? The concept of racial purity, and so the parallels here to the Nazi movement, and that is kind of, the fruition of this idea of racial purity,
sure,
being a cause, and racial impurity being the problem. And so, America experienced in its own way, its own version of this, and as did they in England and other places. So that, I think that's kind of the height of race as rhetorical, fueled by science, fueled by, right, this sense of morality and civilization, and this, Enlightenment story of eventual, conquest. So that clearly was invested with these racial dimensions, and I think you have to look at this. So there, part of the echo in the canyon here of this talk of great replacement is the there's one thing to say, okay, well, we're bringing immigrants in so that they can vote. There's another of saying, okay, well, the election was stolen because illegal immigrants voted, which is a claim that Tucker and Don have made. That's one face, but the full-blown theory that the Jews are doing this, the Jews are sponsoring this so that whites will intermarry and weaken themselves racially, so that they can dominate. So, I don't know if you're familiar with Abby Richards, who's sort of the TikTok conspiracy theorist.
Which one?
She's kind of the one getting the most press right now.
She's not the one
anyway,
running for governor or whatever.
No, I don't think so.
Georgia.
But at any rate, her line is that is kind of the conspiracy theory of no return. That almost every conspiracy theory eventually can be getting eaten up by the great Jewish conspiracy theory. This is where conspiracy theories go to get universalized somehow.
Well, it's the invisible, right? When you look at, again, sort of my little 4-part narrative structure for this, so if you're looking for villains and heroes, victims, and the stakeholders, those are involved. And the villain, the invisible villain, of Jewishness, or like gypsies, or these exotic cultures that are traveling cultures that have existed within other cultures for a long time. It's a pretty easy narrative move to just make that an invisible, demon, the same way that all of demons are invisible, right?
I guess. I mean, and one has to wonder and once again do exploratory surgery on this thing to figure out why that is so basic and so easily transmissible as an ultimate term here, I suppose Christianity, as much as anything.
Right. I do think it's a jump out of religion and Christianity.
I mean, it's right there in
my
training. Right. It is right there in my that somehow basically the Jews are responsible for this. But I, you've experienced that moment in many, at least I have as an academic, that we may be starting about with the Federal Reserve conspiracy, but eventually that becomes the Jewish conspiracy. Wherever you start, the Illuminati, I'm sure, eventually unfolds into. So she's right in a way that's kind of this. Once it gets dumped into that big stream of ultimate conspiracy, it is self-sustaining in that sense, and there's no doubt that the hardcore. Go ahead.
I was going to say, just the mass confusion that happens when all of these elements come crashing into these narrative, arenas, And like you said, well, there's some that seem to dominate over time, and the Jewish conspiracy thing as a narrative structure, that villain seems to have legs.
It would be nice to, know if in the Pan-Asian cultures, if there's any corollary at all.
It would
right,
be interesting, yeah.
To this kind of fail-safe or guaranteed rhetorical vitality that comes from. But certainly hooking this up with Christianity, and of course, if we want to start dismantling the current right wing in America, you've got to go there, and that this is the the greatest hit. So,
well, being trained into all those fundamental narrative structures, all those fundamental logic grooves through Christianity over time, with its repetition and saturation, and teaching things through community and group and songs and chanting, all the things it does to imprint these grooves. In some ways, all these other theories just have to come in and inhabit those pre-made grooves, and they're good at it.
Sure, but see, I think that once again, it's like Nazism. It's like American Nazism right now, that are the peacekeepers and oath keepers, or whoever they are, the Proud Boys. That this is a hardcore. The explicitness of this is in a very small minority of people, and I think a large spectrum of Christians, as well as conservative, our political, however they're distributed, enact some of the dimensions of this without ever going back to that. It's not explicit. It's not explicit and conscious. I think if confronted with that, they'd kind of go, well, in other words, I don't think everybody's explicitly a racist that enacts racial practices, a racist practice, that embodies these distinctions in their readings and interpretations. That doesn't make them personally a racist. And certainly, I don't think anti-Semitism has that kind of conscious, prominence for the majority of people who are walking in step with this thing. In the way
it's easy to walk in step and not know you're in the ranks. You're lightly walking next to the.
Which doesn't mean we shouldn't look at how that, once again, this connects with and fuels. Once again, my metaphor of this kind of set of tumors that are wrapped around the spine are feeding each other through this taproot of some sort.
So at some point, the question turns to, there's understanding this and its antecedents and its techniques. How do you start to counter something like great replacement theory, as a rhetorician? I mean, there's the easy moves that people try to do that seem to they're losing their power of, well, this is the road to Nazism. That's one of the counters that you can see. This is the road toward, young, unbalanced white guys going and shooting things up. So what are the counters that people can start to use as mini rhetoricians?
That's good. And I've recently heard pep talks about this, and you yourself have kind of talked about, okay, well, here's the different things you can do: invite a conservative to lunch, or start picking logically at their arguments, right? Gee, really, how is it that they're injecting a microchip into you, and wouldn't your cell phone get in the way? Starting to parody and humor and dealing with them one-on-one, and having interventions of various sorts. But I think, first of all, we need respect for what we're up against. And I think when we talk about Nazism, and we've paid homage to Burke here in a number of ways, but in his essay about the Mein Kampf, he points out that no, it isn't like all of a sudden everybody in Germany started thinking about the truth of this. It's that it was a crumbling society, and this provided a coherent worldview to people who had no other to pit against it. And so I think the sheer absence of other coherent schemas of sense making that make this impossible, that obviate this, that displace this in a functional way. And so that gets back to our talk about dystopia and utopia. That somehow the dystopia is getting colored with this. Okay. I mean, what is the positive vision? Is there a positive, direct, identifiable, embraceable vision of a progressive, multicultural society where all God's children? You know, I mean, okay, for 50 years, the Democrats have been all mentioning the dream. You know, it's kind of tired. So it's rhetorically there, but it's not quite, you know, the immune system we need at this moment, right? So justice is certainly, you know, I think, but I don't know that it is concretely populated. Once again, we have more Handmaid's Tale kinds of
Well, and
horrific.
thank God that came out, because otherwise people would have no way of describing
There
it.
no touchstone for this whatsoever.
It's
right?
everything I see, like even in front of Amy Coney Barrett's house. Did you see the people dressed up as the Handmaid's
Sure.
Tale, protesting?
Yeah. But what you know, what do we replace that with? What you know, what are the positive, we call them utopias or not, but these synergistic visions that replace kind of the Kennedy whatever, that really directly address and deal with race. Once again, maybe it's just trying to fly under the radar to, and maybe that's why progressives are not quite collectivizing the way they need to fight off what really is a minority, and a regressive minority. So when you know, I think once again, when the world looks like it's sheer confusion and chaos, people will hop on board of something, even if it doesn't meet the ethical test that we would like. So I think one thing we need rhetorically is to create more positive manifestations of what this will look like, and maybe this is something that you know, the identity politics of minorities, they've had, you know, white people to blame in that sense. At least that's the way it feels on the part of many of these white people. Maybe there needs to be also a bridging that sort of says, you know, what does the world look like without this distinction here? What does this look like? Because as you pointed out, you know, 20 minutes ago, the fear of reprisal is certainly fueled the South after the Civil War, and certainly is fueling, you know, I think this anxiety right now. That there is no, you know, equality. There is no time when we won't be making these racial distinctions, and, you know, throwing down, it's better to be on top than be on bottom.
Well, and think about it just again, bloodlessly from a rhetorical perspective. What do you offer the white population that would be a benefit here? Is it just to avoid the war of constantly fighting race wars, the aggravation? Like, what is the benefit to a homogenous culture of allowing in other cultures? And I've seen this across internationally. I had a conversation once with a woman from Holland, and she was talking about how so much of what she grew up with, like the houses and everything else, was being replaced by immigrant aesthetics, coming in and building Mediterranean houses right next to her, you know, quaint, you know, super colored old Holland villages. And so, like, what is the offer? Not just, hey, you should do this because it's a moral thing to share and be equal and to, you know, have an open culture, but for people that do feel that fear of I'm losing here, what is the actual benefit?
Well, part of the problem is, you know, people clinging to the past, and I think that's not completely liberal or conservative. I think we all have a nostalgia, you know, how does one detach from this idea that we're all going to look like little Dutch row houses, and then all of a sudden, you know, that's why progressivism and the future seems like destructive to many people. Yeah, I mean, it's a tough issue. So, you know, the only thing that we've bridged so far, it seems to me, is with kind of the technological aspiration, that somehow and the technological end of modernism will wipe out all of those past things, or in postmodernists sort of pick them up and distribute them randomly so that one shopping center over here looks Dutch and one looks, Mediterranean, and the other looks like some techno nightmare, right? But I think that is the best, that the technological future promises the transcendence of this. It's kind of at the heart of Donna Haraway's thing about the Cyborg Manifesto, right? That eventually the mutation of people with technology is going to leapfrog these dualisms that we, at least that, and keeping in mind that for her that was a science fiction fantasy. It was not a programmatic prescription.
Right.
And we've kind of lost that of late. I think that has been kind of the modernist utopian myth that it would be nice if, in the Jetsons, they had drawn at least a few Black people, wouldn't it?
It's so odd when you think about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Really, the dog and the robot both get agency, but there's not a Black to be found anywhere.
Yeah, I've got, the terms that I throw around for this, like, instead of replacement and things like that, like the actual benefits to white culture are things like innovation, right? Progression, like you get more talent this way. You've seen
those are the great arguments for immigration. Absolutely, that statistically apparently are true, that immigrants are more innovative. They've got less to lose, and so they could take chances that those of us living off the.
I mean, all the way back to Einstein, right? Like, grabbing him from out of Germany, and suddenly we've got a bomb. Look at that.
Yeah.
But I think seeding the discussion with those positives probably needs to be done more, because it all gets drug over into fighting the dystopian racial, stories that are being told, as opposed to building a really strong architecture of, hey, every time you create these multicultures, look at the aesthetic value you get from different music and the art. Look at the innovation you get. Look at the capitalism infusion that you get.
Right. Well, you're always going to have a certain number of people, looking and living life through the rear view mirror. And I think, once again, the only thing that ever puts them in majority is for the forward-looking systems to collapse. And, that is Germany in 33. That is, and I think that's what we have to, the people I've enjoyed listening to, I think the most in the last 5 or 6 years are the conservatives who seem to have not a racist bone in their bodies, who absolutely are not anti-immigration, who see this in a very functional and, I think maybe they're the ones to look to for some guidance here into what what is a conciliatory vision of how this should work. That does not seem to be, that is based on conservative principles. And I'm not saying everybody has to turn to conservative, but I think that's the place for progressivists to, in other words, change the conversation. Let's talk to those people versus a progressive, a purely progressive agenda, and to have some sort of clear guidance about making these sorts of choices. And to keep in mind that it will always be a dialectic. If there isn't one, we will invent it, right? There will always be the extremes on both sides of whatever this is. Right now, the middle is just so freaking murky, nobody can get their hands on it. So I think that as a rhetorician would be my.
Yeah, I think that's that's an interesting.
Change the field of argument, change the design of the conversation completely so that these oppositions can yet occur and be functional. So retreat to some sort of better dialectic.
Well, I think that strategy of functionalism, as the dominating rhetoric for a while makes sense. And I agree, like in the past when I've listened to conservatives that are measured and intellectual about what they're talking about, this idea of, if you just pluck out speed of change, right? That we want a slower managed change versus this massive infusion, which, they get into the narrative of open borders and they're just pouring in here. Like, yeah. That's not what we're really talking about. I want to see your dystopian amplification of this.
Well, it really is. I mean, it really is the dysfunction of our communication system. I mean, if you think about, we've been living on a dialogue that only tries to get to the end of the news cycle, rather let alone the end of the week. Whereas the Chinese can make decisions about policy that look 20 years into the future. Where do we want this thing to be? And I think, once again, the kinds of challenges that are facing us demand that kind of, climate change, on and on and on. And, probably the only place that you're finding that is in the middle of the road, and it's getting beat up by both sides pretty thoroughly, seems to me.
Yeah, it's easily attacked, right? So that's the problem with it, is that it doesn't defend itself. I'm being rational here. Isn't that enough? Like, no. You're still open to
Biden
attack.
saying, well, high gas prices is really a moment in the switch to fossil fuels. Well, people just dumping on his.
Yeah, you can't
make a rational statement like that.
Rational functional is it's one axis, but it's easily destroyed by amplification and unethical rhetoric. Like, it's super easy to go in and blow apart somebody's logical structure with non-logic, because people aren't logical about it anyway. People don't know what that means.
And
this
fear
transition
fear is the emotion that will circuit that, and that is why it is being used. That whatever it is we have to fear, whatever confusion there is about this, or whatever uncertainty exists.
So functionalists have to have a stronger spear to drive in with their functional thing.
Well, or maybe back to your campaign, maybe we need to be more functional about communication. Maybe we need to realize that the health and functioning of the communication system itself is a dynamic, and start looking for pollution in it, and toxins, and get rid of them as much as possible.
It seems like that, we haven't talked about this, but we could maybe dive in at some future point about, like, watching Elon Musk come in and say, I'm going to buy up Twitter and change the rules again, and just watching everybody go, oh my God, it's like the abortion debate. Hey, we got to a place where we're somewhere in the middle and everybody's pretty stable. Like with Twitter, keep Trump out, keep the extremists out as much as you can, and we'll be okay. And somebody comes in and goes, nope, I'm going to reopen the gate. Here we go. And that kind of explosive media environment, explosive public discourse environment versus a moderated, or, nobody wants the highly super controlled, nobody gets to talk environment. But that middle ground, like you said, is so attackable right now, even though it seems to be like that's what everybody could live with.
Well, back to the old, it just doesn't sell newspapers that well. I mean, and who's around with the memory? Oh my God, interest rates are climbing to 3%.
Right.
I bought this house, it was 11.5%, and that was already down from the worst. My students during the Bush junior years, my children's student loans were 8.5%, which I thought was criminal. The student loans were, So, but what the headline is, of course, this is the worst inflation in 50 years. Well, if they're not, and then of course, one headline today is, well, maybe it's not as bad as they're saying, realizing that this is itself a construct, and one based on,
Well, and I think that explosive media environment, which I break down when I work for businesses between scan, mid dive, and deep dive, because it's something people can get instantly. And I'm like, you just live in scan. Maybe you go down a little bit into mid dive if you're a thinker and you like to read a little bit. Almost nobody goes into the deep dive on any of these things like we're doing here. I mean, the fact that you can you start with just the phrase itself, great replacement. That is, how come it's great? Well, because it's everybody's getting replaced, right? Like, it's massive. And then replaced, we're not just being evolved, or like it's going to be mixed, like we're gone. And those two terms put together are this super powered dystopian vision that's like bam, and it just takes over everything for a while.
Right. I guess it's back to my original my query of I'm imagining this marcher at Charlotte in the Steve Bannon mode of being concerned about being replaced. What place do you hold this is a concern? I don't know what vision of the world you have that imports you this way. But yeah, like, okay, this means white people can't breed, have children. What do you mean by this, that you're replaced? You will never have a job. What's that?
I said everybody gets their own tiki torch.
You'll actually
That's how
be,
we
you know,
fight
your
back.
place in society will be determined based on your merit. You know,
Well, and maybe too, it's like when you look at stoking fear, you know, up here you have the wealthy people who are always afraid that I guess they're going to lose 1% of their wealth. And then the people, the Trumpies, the rally goers, who are clearly most of them not doing that well financially in the culture as it is. You'd like to be able to go, hey, you know, I know you think like you're winning at some level and it's going to get worse if immigrants come in or other cultures or other races are competing with you, but maybe it'll fracture things and you'll actually be able to do better because you're not doing that great right now.
you know, I think maybe, and that maybe that's true of a certain percentage. I rather think that for most of them, that is itself a perception that has been sold to them that they're not doing so well. You know, these pickup trucks that I see going down the road with Trump flags in the middle, they're
Nice.
newer than mine. Yeah. And I drive by houses where there's 2 of them in the yard with an RV.
You think they're getting the racist discount somewhere?
And
like
I think
the MAGA discount?
at some point, you know, when they were talking about, oh, the Trump are these poor, struggling blue collar workers. Well, some of them, but the average income is around 70, 75K. And there's a lot of wealthy Republicans that are loyalist Trumps.
Sure.
So I think it's more of a psychological state. And once again, if you look at how many people think we're already in a recession, it's back to a set of confusions about, you know, if the stock market is down and you're not earning 10% for doing nothing, you think somehow there's something wrong with the world. So I guess I would challenge that perception has been created that we're not doing that well. Certainly through the Midwest, through the Rust Belt, there's been a major change, and undoubtedly a change that was coming in many ways anyway. And the, you know, these immigrants that are working in these packing plants, that's because your children really didn't want to go there. So.
Well, is this an offshoot then of our promissory culture, our American dream culture? Like it's all carrot, right? Like I was thinking about this last night. It's just
carrots all the way down.
It's carrots everywhere, and like this illusion of, oh, I didn't get that carrot, you know, or that carrot's even bigger. And you get this, I mean, it's programmed into America it's a carrot country.
Sure. Well, I remember 20 some years ago talking about, you know, the rhetoric of diminished expectations.
But that's a tough sell. Nobody wants it. That's what Reagan wrote in on, right? Carter was kind of diminishing expectations and trying to right size our sense of ourselves. And Reagan's like, oh, don't want to do that. Big carrot. Hit people with
came out and told the truth. Whoa,
yeah,
terrible.
It's not a big stick. It's a big carrot.
There is that. You know, I remember about those years of the Reagan years and saying, I didn't think I would ever do as well as my parents. Absurd. I remember your friend Rod Hart saying, why do you say that? I said, well, you know, my parents spent nothing on quality of life. They accumulated a fair bit of, money, but the system worked for a white middle class guy.
Yeah, for a little while.
with a cushy job. Yeah. So
my grandfather was a, you know, contract carpenter through a place, and they had a house, a boat, 2 cars, and they would take off a month or 5 or 6 weeks in the winter and go down to Florida. You know, I'm like, how did you do that? One income.
So I think that is another way to attack this, is we need a more functional, better class rhetoric, because there really are people that are not gaining in the system. And there's no doubt that the system, you know, we have in the last 20 years created a lot of wealthy people. We have also had an ascending Black middle class, which I think fuels the competition, the sense of being replaced. And that's a good thing. That is absolutely a good thing. But once again, the people who resent that. So I think there is a core anger, a core backlash, once again, in the kind of the Midwestern Rust Belt kind of, you know, where people are struggling because things cost a lot of money. And yeah, you may have a new pickup truck, but you owe a lot on it. And sending your kids to college is looking like a big ticket item, and your job's not really getting any better. So once again, the carrot's not looking too good. But once again, where do they point? What's the ability to capitalize on that by pointing to immigration, by pointing to replacement theory, by racism, and of course, Obama gave them exactly the segue they needed to make that the focus. And I just, there's no doubt in my mind that the next election is, unfortunately, the word colored by that, the penumbra of that set of expectations that we're fighting in Georgia today to make sure Stacey Abrams is not.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with this backlash. Like you said, every time a new face enters an old institution, the first Black female justice, the first Latino female justice, and suddenly it's like the reactivity of, oh, we've got to get the whitest of the white in there now, like Alito and all these people to counter this. Like, that is such a, maybe that is the when you think of adjusting a population away from a traditional rhetoric of the way it looks and the way people look and things like that, maybe that we need to think more about that. Like, how do we do the great adjustment to the white population so this doesn't look like an incursion or a threat?
But at the same time, and if you're on the other side of this conflict, progress really is not going to be made until we have a Black woman on the Supreme Court, until we have another Black, president. And once again, the liabilities of that seem almost frightening right now. What do you lose? So I think we're farther away from that kind of obviation of that as this flashpoint issue than we have been for a long time. I think to me that and once again, this is an academic mission, but recognizing that this is at the core of so much that we're going through has got to be, at least one avenue of people not recognizing how much race is embroiled in all of these issues. And for some part of the population, that's explicit in what they want.
Well, and I've argued that one of the techniques is this sort of super amplification or saturation is a really interesting technique in these situations. So an all Black Supreme Court, and I argued for a while that, hey, females weren't allowed to vote for almost 250 years in this culture. So logically, males should not be able to vote for the next 250 years and then a 50-year penalty. So for the next 300 years, just female government, and then come back and tell me what this all looks like. Because that's the kind of, dramatic, amplified, it's comedy and exaggeration, but it definitely shines a light on, it takes you out of that middle ground, that slow kind of like this, and go, no, just slam it all the way over here and then take a look at what that looks like, and then maybe you won't be afraid of that middle transition ground so much.
Well, it's a perspective by incongruity,
right?
Definitely, and that is one way to continue to foil, keep on making this distinction, right? I think, and in the meantime, that will buy you, sort of like holding the front line while you do subversion on the other, fronts. Continue to repopulate so much of our world with the normalization of these relationships. Black people in positions of power, Black people in the media represent, and so that eventually, and I think, I think it's going to be generational. I think there's no doubt that we are at a generational moment, and eventually, some people die off and the other ones will do what it takes to stay alive, right?
Yeah, it has been interesting having two kids that are 18 and 21 right now, or 22 and 19, and have seen them coming up through Austin and their orientation just to sexuality and gender. Like, they both went to a progressive high school, an arts high school.
Sure.
And they're like, it's not even like, they can't even wrap their minds around the other vision of looking at this, like, these people are dangerous. Like, have you been around them? Like, right. They're just people,
Well, that was a stat that's out there that actually from 15 and younger, and I don't even know how old the stat is, but already minorities outnumber white people in the 15 years and younger category. So
my son had a funny moment in middle school with a girl that he liked, and he was talking to her somehow in a group or whatever. She goes, I would date you, but I date black guys and Latinos. And she was mixed. She was like Asian, Latino, or something like that. And he's like, oh, how did I get out of the mix? She goes, I don't date white guys. I'm like,
you've been replaced.
Yeah, you've been replaced. And he's like, it's so, I'm like, that's all right. She'll come around. Like, eventually, that's the cool thing, I think, about lived experience as rhetorical tool and change.
Sure.
Like, there's no way that communities don't adjust to each other if they actually get real deep experience with each other. You just can't deny the basic humanity of being around somebody all the time to go, oh, it's a human being. I don't care what color it is or gender or whatever.
Well, I think about George Will's line, the conservative commentator George Will, of that his children regard being gay about the way we regarded being left-handed. It's a difference that doesn't make a difference. And among that generation, how these Florida moves to prevent us from even talking about being gay in school. What a great separation.
That's it. The great separation theory.
It's back to living in this sort of Orwellian universe for these children, where the lines do become clear. And that does, I think, ultimately challenge the power of the people who enforce that kind of crap. And one has to think that eventually they'll just burn out.
It's gotta fade in power. Although, like you said, like the Jewish villain coming back up into American rhetoric at this point, you're like, really? Like, that still has power? And it's just crazy, like, rhetorically, how these things perseverate as fundamental to the ecology that you're dealing with, this kind of policy.
And I think the strategy has to be to so repopulate the symbolic diet and world that people do not, they're not able to heap all of these frustrations in one pile to seek a final solution. So only in that kind of extreme circumstances can the majority of people sort of decide, that must be the way it is. That this is back to the old Jewish plot of trying to, weaken the white race in their domination. Once again, there can be a lot of noisemakers out there, Donald Trumps and Tucker Carlson's and Fox News. And one has to proceed with some faith that at least they're. I'm not saying don't be afraid that they might win this next election. And that's not what I'm saying.
The difference that I had this discussion
that would only hasten their end.
I had this discussion with another, not that you're typical or traditional rhetorician, that I'm like, yeah. She wanted to throw it all the way back to the Greeks, and like somebody she cited, like, they were using all these misogynies and all these different type of anti culture and ethnic talk even back then successfully. I'm like, yeah, but they didn't have a production machine that looks like Fox News. Like, the production of lies, the quality of the lie production is insane, and the distribution of it is insane. So you can't really pull me back into the content and the technique. I do think, like, just to wrap up here, that essentially what we're saying is that we need a great replacement of that other rhetoric. We need to bring out, so that's our great replacement activity.
I think a combination, a number of fronts. Once again, subversion. I think your techniques of incongruity that continue to thwart those things by the development of ironic reversal, and to show that that's just the absurdity of it. But I think once again, sort of accept that there will always be a need for that vanguard. I mean, that was Orwell's final moment, wasn't it? That the face of humanity will always be there for the boot of tyranny to crush. That somehow this isn't going away, right? that the people manufacturing this poop for easy political gain are always going to be there, requiring the comedic work on it, as well as as we've identified, we need rhetoric that somehow rebolsters a vision of the future that is inclusive, that shows a better path, and it has, once again, idealism has to work. If it's not working
materially, it has to have material results that people are like, oh, the more ideal I get, the more money I make.
But and once again, I think we're right. Although I've tried to say, blaming media all these years has been a matter of blaming the messenger. I think there's a right to say, the way that media are so fractured now into social media and cable news and whatnot, and people's ways of intersecting it. There isn't a dominant. There's something really wrong with Elon Musk saying, "I want to buy the public square," and then be the only voice, and then be the only voice on it. Right?
Yeah, I would love to buy the public square.
There's something fundamentally wrong here when even that conversation could take place. So I think, given that, those are new sets of challenges, as we've observed before, which only ups the ante for intersecting and strategizing on all those fronts again, but somehow feeding a more positive vision and challenging these kinds of false perceptions, like, are you really that poorly off compared to what? Where do these ideas come from? Anyway, lots of work for the rhetorician.
Always, the rhetoricians need to be, central to the game, and that's the real solution. It's control your language, or it's going to control you.
Yeah, I guess Machiavelli was at the court, but I think it's usually the jester that actually gets to hang around. So maybe your bifurcated profession here.
Yeah, maybe
the jester hat may get you closer.
It's like, hey, I'm just a jester. Don't listen to the things that I'm actually saying that deconstruct everything you believe. So, well, cool. This has been super fun again. I think, this idea of eventually rhetoric just dragging all these great ideas over and, dropping them in front of people and say, hey, use this one for a little bit. See if this helps you replace, this sort of great replacement theory, so that we do have some tools to fight back in pragmatic ways. It's always the idea. So thanks once again. Thanks once again from Florida, David Payne. We will come back around. Get out there and persuade people. As always, they need it.